Alrighty, there's a response to my recent video about Final Fantasy weapons, which included Sephiroth's Masamune. Let's see what that's all about. You better have good arguments or I'll tear you apart. Just kidding. Thanks for the response. And let's see, maybe I was too skeptical.
Hey everyone, so I recently saw Skallagrim's recent video about fantasy swords, and he spends the first third or so talking about Sephiroth's sword and how it's a fantasy sword. But it actually isn't.
Well, I have looked at swords that are about the height of the user, maybe slightly longer. That's not the you know what? Before I start babbling, I'm going to let you continue. We'll get to it.
So today I'm going to talk about the Slanted, which is a giant Korean sword like this.
I wasn't actually aware of that, so thank you for bringing that to my attention. I knew of the Nodachi, of course, which Sephiroth's sword is based on, but the Korean Sangsudo I had not heard of. So, I mean, it looks very similar.
And I also run the Sydney Korean Historic Fencing School, which is a Korean historic fencing school.
Practical experience that informs your opinion is always good.
And it's essentially Korean HEMA, so we look at source materials and we try and recreate.
So it's Hakuma. Almost sounds like Akuma. Can you imagine Akuma with a sword? That thing better be sturdy.
In Korean they call them jangdo, literally long swords. And so that would be anything with a blade length over 80 centimeters.
So 81 centimeters is this kind of big sword, and 80 centimeters, or 79 and a half is not. Yeah, I've talked about the issues with setting hard boundaries. It's generally kind of weird because when you look at two things that look identical to the naked eye, and then you say, well, this is one thing and this is the other thing, just based on, 1 centimeter or whatever. But of course, how else are you going to do it, right? Otherwise, you'd just have to say, well, there's a broad range, but we can't really define the range because there's so much gradient. Anyway, this is not a criticism, obviously. It's just one of those fun things.
Category. One is the Jerokun, which is my main style, and you'll see plenty of that on my channel. And the other one is this sword here, the Sangsudo, which is literally two-handed sword. And so they range from about 1.7 to about 210 centimeters.
210? Wow, we're into pro wrestler height category. It's like a couple centimeters on The Undertaker, isn't it?
So this one here is 175 centimeters. And as you can see, it's a fairly big sword. Skallagrim talks about how you need immense strength to use this and how it's so unwieldy and heavy.
Well, technically it was Laura who talked about how much strength she imagines it would require. That's a matter of perspective. That's not really my main concern here. That's more of a issue with the Buster sword rather than this.
It weighs about 1.6 kilos. It's a touch on the light side. But if you look at the measurements listed in the historic manual, then it's for a 1.8 meter long sword, and it weighs about 1.8 kilos.
Yeah, that's not bad at all.
If you look at, Wallhangers in Germany, Montante in Spain, they're actually fairly wieldable, and this is quite the same.
Yeah. The really heavy ones are the extra large ceremonial two-handed swords that tend to go over 4 kilograms or whatever. Yeah, those are ridiculous, but they weren't intended for use.
But 1.8 kilo sword, even at this length, is not particularly hard to wield, as long as you don't try and stop the momentum.
Now, notice, by the way, the blade here is quite a bit shorter than the one I showed in the video. How do I know? Looks like you and I are not terribly different in height. I'm like a couple centimeters taller, but I could barely sheath it because essentially the distance from the tsuba to the tip was just about my wingspan, almost longer. So when I stretched my arms as far as they possibly went, I could just about manage to resheath it, whereas it looks like you can unsheath it much more easily than that. So the blade on this one is definitely shorter.
But as for actually swinging it, doing it one-handed is actually really not a problem.
That is definitely not the issue. We'll get to the actual issue.
This one doesn't have the traditional blade collar. So in Korea, then they talk about having a blade collar that's 1 foot. So about 30 centimeter long habaki.
Oh, wow.
What that does is it helps
I've never seen that. That's interesting.
to stiffen the blade higher up. And
that's basically just a different way of how it's done with European swords, where typically the base is left thick. Like you don't put an edge on it. On a greatsword, usually there's like a ricasso, so the blade is much thicker there, and typically they have a distal taper anyway. So that's how you retain more rigidity lower down on the blade.
And it also gives you a place so that you can overgrip
Yes.
it.
Yeah, that's also the purpose of that.
Quite like those wallhangers in Germany.
That's interesting. I had no idea that they did that. That's very interesting to know. So yeah, just rather than having a ricasso, whether it be leather wrapped or not, you just lengthen the collar there and get the same effect.
I couldn't afford one having that because it would have cost me an arm and a leg, so I've got one that doesn't have it, and it is a little bit floppy, but it's usable. It's usable.
You can counteract that for sure. Like it really just depends on how you shape the blade. There are things you can do with the cross section to stiffen it. It depends on how thick the blade is. Of course, the thicker you make it, the stiffer it is, but also the heavier it is. There are a number of ways to tweak that. And of course, the one that I handled there that was so floppy is, I should have pointed that out at the time. That one is just a decorative wall hanger, so it's not made to be fully functional. So that one is extra floppy. But the issue that I see here, even if you make it rigid, at a certain length, there's so much leverage working on that blade, so you may risk bending it or breaking it at a certain point. Not this one. I mean, this is more of a risk than a shorter blade. There are definitely disadvantages of making a blade so long, but Sephiroth's blade is even longer than that. In this segment, he talks about the history of the Sangsuro, which I'm not going to play here because you're supposed to go to Just the Bugs channel and watch the video there yourself, which is linked in the description below. So I'm just going to skip ahead.
So this is actually not a fantasy weapon. It's a historic weapon with a...
In this form, yes. Just the way Sephiroth's sword is proportioned is fantasy. I'll get back to that in a moment.
historic manual so that you can learn the techniques yourself. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm working on my own interpretation. This video was a little bit fast-tracked by Skallagrim's video because I was planning on making a video about it once when I was happy with the interpretation, which will probably be in maybe a year or two. Usually takes me a few years of working on something before I'm happy with it.
That's fair.
But for today, I think I'll show you, we'll talk about 3 different ways that you can draw one of these, because that was the other thing that Skallagrim struggled with in his video.
Yeah, because we were trying to do it politely, because we were in a sword store and didn't own the thing. So the easiest way is to just grab it and you just toss the scabbard away. Or even just push the tsuba with the thumb and then let it fall. That's not the problem. No matter how long it is, you can just pop it and then throw the scabbard, basically. But as said, we didn't want to do that in the store. Sheathing is a different story, though. If the blade is your wingspan or longer, it's going to be either very difficult or pretty much impossible to sheath it unless you just put it on the ground and sheath it that way. That's possible. But if you want to be holding on to it, then that gets really challenging.
So now you know a bit about the sword. Let's talk about the 3 ways that it's documented of how to draw the sword. So Chijiguang talks about the first 2, and the third comes from the Korean Sangsuro manual. So the first one was pretty obvious. You get someone else to take away the sheath, usually your servant or someone. Chijiguang in his Chinese manual talks about the second way, which is if there are 2 of you with the Sangsuro, then you both take away each other's sheaths, and then you're both drawing your swords and you're ready to go.
So, but still somebody else helping, yeah.
What happens if you're by yourself? Well, in the Korean manual for the Sangsuro, then there's the first posture is the drawing posture, and it's called Kyonjok Chogumse, which is literally when you see the enemy, then you draw the sword. So it says hold it in reverse grip in your left hand, make a circle around your head, and then draw the sword. Okay.
That I did not think of. I mean, I'm not sure I could have done that with the sword at the shop because, as I said, the blade was extremely long. So I kind of doubt I would have been able to do that.
Now, big issue is that you drop your sheath.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the other way is to just toss it. Just fling it off the blade. That works.
As for resheathing it, second person, or hold out as far as you can, tip the tip in,
Yeah, that works as long as the blade doesn't exceed
The tip, yeah.
the distance between your two hands. Which I'm pretty sure Sephiroth's sword does. Thank you for the response. You brought up a few things I wasn't aware of, and it's always good to have a back and forth dialogue as opposed to just blabbering into a camera via monologue. So just to clarify, which I should have done at the time, my concern with Masamune is not really the size, like the total length. It's the proportions, because there's way too much blade and not enough handle. Usually as you lengthen the sword, you know, whether it be a Nodachi or a European two-handed greatsword, you generally lengthen the handle as well. So the longer it is, the more handle you've got. I've shown a few that have a very long handle, and that's really what you want to be able to have the leverage you need. The advantage of a polearm over a very long sword is that you can change your grip position. You can widen the grip as much as you need to resist any kind of pressure or pull on the weapon. Like I talked about in another video linked down below, by the way, you can do that with a two-handed sword as well if it has a ricasso, although it's more cumbersome because the guard is in the way. But Sephiroth's sword doesn't even have that. It looks like it's sharpened all the way down. If you're limited in how far you can keep the hands apart, if you were fighting a polearm user with such a long sword with a relatively short handle, you know, relative to the overall length, the polearm user could basically just walk up to you and hook onto the blade and just pull it down. There's very little you can do about it. Whereas if both have a polearm, they try to manipulate each other's polearm. If you widen the grip, you have much more leverage to hold against the force that the opponent applies. This looks like a fairly typical Nodachi handle length. In fact, on some pieces of artwork, it even looks more like a katana handle length, which is strange. And then the blade is insanely long. So that's really the problem with that. The blade could be made strong enough, especially considering that the user has superhuman strength. So you could make the blade significantly wider and thicker. I mean, not too wide really, because the problem with the Buster Sword always is, even though the blade is obviously strong enough to withstand all the crazy forces, the weak spot would be where the blade transitions into the tang, because even if you make the transition round, the shoulders, I mean, round to minimize the risk of stress fractures right there, the kinds of forces that are involved when Cloud swings that thing are substantial. And of course, the handle is always the limiting factor. You cannot make the handle larger than the hands are able to wrap around and use effectively. But I think with Sephiroth's sword, it would probably be fine to just make it a little bit sturdier, so make it heavier overall, which it can easily handle. But yeah, the proportions make it quite awkward to wield, in my opinion, even with super strength, because it's very different from historical swords of that length. They tend to have longer handles. Anyway, that's about all I've got. Again, thank you for the response, and thanks for watching this video. Hope you found it entertaining. Take care, folks.